Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Thoughtful Bro. I am here with Stephen Greenblatt. I am so excited to have him here. I was just telling him in the green room that, honest to God, he is one of my favorite writers working today. And boy, does he know how to spin a tale. I can't wait to get into talking about Christopher Marlowe and Shakespeare with him today. Thank you so much for being with us. A few words before we get started. We're live streaming on A Mighty Blaze on Facebook and YouTube. As always, we're here talking about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. In today's case, what makes Elizabethan theater tick. At A Mighty Blaze, we're never asking for money. If you want to show us the love, you can just like us and repost us and tell your friends about us. Or if you do want to spend money, you can spend it on fascinating biographies of Elizabethan playwrights, books like Dark Renaissance by Stephen Greenblatt. And we're going to put a link to buy that book through bookshop.org in the chat and support indie bookstores. Regarding questions, as always, just put them in the comments and we'll try to get to some at the end if we have time. A little bit about our guest today. Stephen Greenblatt is the Kogan University Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University. He's written extensively on English Renaissance literature and acts as the general editor of the Norton Anthology of English Literature and the Norton Shakespeare. He's the author of 14 books, including one of my favorite all-time books, The Swerve, which was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. And he also wrote Will in the World, which is a biography of William Shakespeare, which was a New York Times bestseller. His new book is about a writer in the Elizabethan theater who he credits with the cultural awakening of an entire nation. And no, his name is not William Shakespeare. The new book is called Dark Renaissance, The Dangerous Times and Fatal Genius of Shakespeare's Greatest Rival. It's the story of Christopher Marlowe, a gay, atheist, transgressive, tormented, double-crossing, dangerous, counterfeiting criminal and spy who assaults taboos and literally risks his life by staging his incredible plays. The Wall Street Journal said, Mr. Greenblatt tells this murky but exhilarating tale with pace and gusto. I couldn't agree more. I'm so happy to have him here, a man who I believe embodies everything a scholar and a writer should be. Stephen Greenblatt, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very kind of you. Exaggerated, but very kind.
All right. Speaking of pace and gusto, I just can't even tell you how much I want to talk to about with you today. So let's just get right into it. Can you just start by telling us why did you want to write a book about Christopher Marlowe? Obviously, you've written a lot about Elizabethan theater, and there's also a lot of other books about Christopher Marlowe. But why did you look at Christopher Marlowe and think I can add something to the conversation?
Well, I first of all been interested in Marlowe for a long time. Way back when, I wrote a little bit about him as the embodiment of a kind of radical freedom. I didn't know very much about his life at that point, but just startled by his work. Mm-hmm. This was back in 1980, really a long time ago, in a book called Renaissance Self-Fashioning. And then I had in the back of my mind that, well, maybe one of these days I will come back and think about Marlowe, and then I did.
Yeah. And is there a big thesis here? I mean, it's sort of teased a little bit in some of the jacket copy that kind of like, if there were no Marlowe, there would be no Shakespeare. No Marlowe, maybe there would be no Renaissance in England. What is, if there is a big theory, how would you characterize it?
Well, let's start with not a big theory, but a little theory or a medium theory or a simple observation. Shakespeare and Marlowe were born the same year, actually, just a few months apart, 1564.
Yeah.
Marlowe, and this is a spoiler alert, Marlowe was murdered at the age of 29 in 1593. If Shakespeare had been murdered instead of Marlowe, if Shakespeare had been murdered in 1593 instead of Marlowe, we would think, we, meaning people like me who spend their lives working on this, you would never have heard of Shakespeare, but people who spend their lives on it would say, Shakespeare, he's that guy who wrote the slasher play, Titus Andronicus,
right? And
that sort of not particularly amusing comedy called Two Gentlemen of Verona. Right. And didn't he have his hand in Henry VI, parts 2 and 3?
Right.
And that's it. And Marlowe, we don't know what he would have done had he lived longer, but by 1593, he had written a succession of plays that had already transformed Elizabethan theater. So we start there with the fact that when things were very quiet, nothing interesting, as far as I could tell, happening, there was an explosion, and that explosion was the works of Christopher Marlowe. It's always possible to come up with extravagant statements. Without Marlowe, there would be no X and Y, and maybe that's true, but these counterfactuals are always tricky. What we do know is what actually happened, which was that a moment in which England, and the theater in particular, was a cultural wasteland. This weird character came along and wrote a succession of plays that totally exploded the capacities of the theater in a way that his exact contemporary Shakespeare fully took advantage of, understood and took advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, he is sometimes cast in this John the Baptist light, like prepare the way of the bard, if you will. But it's the book is absolutely gripping in terms of like kind of what a figure Marlowe really was, not just as a playwright, but just, boy, he had his finger in a lot of different pies. And
I love your list of adjectives and to describe him, and it is the case that he was a complicated piece of work.
Oh, to say the least.
Yeah.
All right, so let's just set the stage, if you will, a little bit. Let's talk about London in the 1580s. This is, here's another litany of adjectives, or words anyway. This is like a filthy, oppressed, dangerous, truly awful place. I mean, he writes about hell in Dr. Faustus, but it's like, I often was just like, he was just describing London. It just sounds like this like infested bog of a place where there's like secret police and repression and raw sewage and tenements and hovels. I've heard you compare it to kind of like the North Korea or Iran of today. It's just a wild thing to say, but just explain what London was kind of physically and culturally.
I mean, the center of London doesn't correspond to what you've just said at all, or what I've said at all. The center of London, the core palace and the cathedral. I mean, this was these were beautiful and would have they've survived to this day as pieces of them in any case as beautiful. So in the absolute center of it, I mean, insofar as, life was hard, and this is a period before when it got dark at night, it really got dark. I mean, and there it was a risky world that way, but still the core of London was, wouldn't have horrified a visitor, far from it. But once you got outside that core, London, which was a huge city at that point, I think rivaling Naples, which was the largest European city, was at that point. But London the population was growing, but it wasn't growing, how should we say, attractively. It was just a mess, the city. And we know this from accounts of visitors who came to the city. We know it from the very voluminous records of the basically police administration that was trying to keep control of the city. You have to imagine for a second, Mark, that there's nothing like now if you walk around London or if you walk around New York, you know that your picture is being taken all the time. Yeah. I mean, it's always astonishing when something usually ghastly happens that they can almost within an hour reconstruct exactly where that person was, because actually without knowing it, our pictures are constantly being taken. We're being watched. And our lives are in that sense sort of fully open, for better and worse, to the public view. That's not true in any European city, certainly not true in London in the later 16th century. It is a city with a very high criminal rate of criminal activity, especially after dark, when it's impossible for anyone to see what the hell is going on. Plus, you have to imagine, I said that Marlowe and Shakespeare both were born in the 1560s. 1560s and 70s are a very difficult time, not simply in London, but in England. You have a country that is basically broken into two factions that hate each other. I know this will be very unfamiliar to anyone today, but
can't imagine.
This is a world in which the Catholics hate the Protestants hate the Catholics, the Protestants hate the radical Protestants, the Catholics hate both the radical Protestants and the moderate Protestants. I mean, it is a rough world, and it's a world that's building up to 1588, when there was an attempt to stage a foreign invasion, which would have led, if the weather had cooperated, which would have led to the killing of the Queen, the killing of her advisors, and the reestablishment of Catholicism as the religion of the land.
Yeah.
But leading up to that, there were a set of plots and conspiracies designed to, if possible, kill the Queen, restore the old regime, and so forth and so on. It's a very tense world. And that means, because there aren't pictures being taken all the time of you, it meant that the government, which was feeling unstable, had to listen very carefully to what was being said at the street corners and in the inns. And if you said something that didn't please the government, there were absolutely no constraints of the kind that we expect, no public space, no right to have your own opinion. You would find yourself in desperate trouble.
And certainly not any kind of no legitimate trial and habeas corpus. And
well, there was trial, but I mean, if you were put on trial for treason or for atheism, blasphemy, it was a foregone conclusion what was going to happen to you.
Yeah.
I mean, so that this is a world that had a legal system. That's why we actually know what was going on. But it's a legal system that is overwhelmingly tilted toward the government's case.
Yeah. So it's an intense time. It is an extremely intense time. And I guess what I'm trying to kind of grasp here, and as we set the stage here for Marlowe and Shakespeare showing up, is kind of like, what about this age made it ripe for such a kind of Cambrian explosion of creativity? I have to say, once years ago, I was listening to an interview with Bertrand Russell, the English philosopher, and I believe he made a comment along these lines that you mentioned the Spanish Armada, a moment ago, but if the English had not defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, there's no Shakespeare. That was the heart of what he said. So, but what do you think about that? And just kind of any other thoughts about kind of why was this a particularly ripe time for these kind of breakout artistic works?
Like everything else that happens in our lives, like the fall of the Soviet Union or the collapse of Lehman Brothers, it only looks inevitable after it's happened. Before, you wouldn't have guessed in a million years that this was going to happen. If you were born into the 1560s and 70s, you would think England is going to be it will be remembered in 400 years. The glories of Elizabethan England, the fabulous creativity. Yes, it's all true, but it happened actually in the last couple of decades of the rule. The Queen came to the throne in 1559, but it was really only in the last decades that it exploded, and it exploded because of a handful of people, Christopher Marlowe, William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, a few other people, that suddenly burst. So your question's a good one, Mark. Yeah. Why does this happen? And as I say, hindsight is 20/20, but you can say a few things. In the early 16th century, in the early years of Henry VIII, the Queen's father, there was actually a lot going on culturally. People were traveling to the continent, bringing back all kinds of cool stuff that was happening in literature and art from France and from Italy, from Spain. And it looks like things are actually sort of about to blossom. And then they're stopped. They're stopped because the country goes through a succession of ferocious regime changes, from Catholic to Protestant to Catholic again to Protestant again, each one of which is accompanied by persecution and bloodletting, so that by the 1560s and 1570s, people are just, sort of basically covering themselves. I mean, it's very risky to do anything interesting at that point. But the materials, as it were, are there. And the reason that the materials are there, as I said, already early in the century, things were happening. And the Elizabethan school system, the curriculum, had been rethought in ways that often you think these things are minor. It's actually, you try to talk to someone about the Elizabethan school curriculum, their eyes immediately get heavy and they're about to fall asleep. But actually, it's what people teach in school is quite important. As we know now, when people try to censor books, not censor books, and so forth, that the things that kids read actually, when they go to school, count. And what had happened was that the people who ran the schools, of course, the schools only reached a tiny percentage of the population, but the people who ran those schools decided to teach the school was mostly taught in Latin. They taught incredibly exciting works in Latin. They taught Ovid and Virgil and Catullus and Terence. They diminished the amount of heavy medieval theology, and they expanded the amount of imaginative literature. So that the people who are going to school have their heads, actually, as long as they are learning and reading, they begin to have their heads full of quite interesting stuff that doesn't correspond to the official line about anything.
Yeah.
But they can't say anything.
Right.
And so you have a kind of, let's say you have a kind of tinderbox.
Yes.
And what we're waiting for, right, or at least in retrospect, what we were waiting for was someone to light a match and see what was going to happen. And the person who lit that match, or at least such is the argument to my book, was Christopher Marlowe.
Oh, I can't wait to get into that. But before we do, I mean, on this show, I'm just always fascinated with like what makes great storytelling happen. Anything that gets to the mystery of like, why do great stories get told is something I'm interested in. So this is perfectly germane to that. But just one last question before we get into Marlowe himself. I'm interested in this idea of like what role art has in a culture. And I heard you describe the Elizabethan theater in a highly oppressive and controlled free kind of anti-free speech environment. Somehow the theater was they could sort of, relatively at least, say whatever they wanted. I mean, Shakespeare says this thing like a dog would be obeyed in office, right? Whereas you say if he said that in a bar, he might get arrested. But somehow on the stage, it's okay. The question is why? Who made that decision and why?
It is weird and fascinating, exactly as you say. It works out, well, several different things. First of all, you couldn't say anything you wanted on the stage. You couldn't mention any contemporary powerful person in disparaging terms and hope to get away with it. They would come down like a ton of bricks on you. And you couldn't directly address any of the theological conflicts that were so much at the center of the tension of this period. Nonetheless, you're right, or I'm right, that as long as you didn't cross certain lines, you could say things that you couldn't say anywhere else. And the answer, well, we don't have a clear answer except to say that societies often do that. Societies that are repressive often have, strangely enough, safety zones in which they can let off some steam. Now, you could say there's several different explanations. One is that what I've just said, that certain people, the powers that be, recognize that it's not safe to try to shut up absolutely everything, that you have to let some people, you have to have some spaces in a society in which people can say bullshit or whatever, but and not get destroyed. So if they're going to do that, they have to pick a space that seems to be unimportant, that doesn't count, that seems to be you can't have people say that kind of thing in church or in the Houses of Parliament. You can have a place that, and you don't want them to say it in the street, as it were, but you can demarcate call it play space, in which you let the kids be a little wild.
I read this wonderful book once about the history of African-American art in this country. And there was a little story about a tribe in Africa and the reason that they had performance and theater in that tribe. And they said it was because the chief was so powerful in that tribe that you couldn't give direct feedback to the chief. But what you could do is perform a play in front of the chief where the chief would be like implicitly criticized, like, here's what's going on in the tribe, and somebody pretends to be the chief. But that has always stuck with me as kind of like, how do you communicate with an unchecked power? And often it's through the arts.
Yes, I'm not. That it is that is genuinely interesting, and I think must happen often. Whether it happened in this period or not, that is to say, whether the rulers took seriously what was being said, I don't. I don't know. What I do know is that on the Elizabethan stage, from let's say from the 1580s or certainly the 90s on, from there they English playwrights staged over and over again the toppling of the ruler and the killing of the ruler, and which couldn't be a subject that couldn't be broached, as it were, outside. And then, lo and behold, in 1642, there's a civil war, and in 1649 they kill the king.
Yeah.
So it's as if they've rehearsed the thing for 50 years before they do it.
Yeah. All right. So let's get into this fascinating lightning rod that strikes the tinderbox of the Elizabethan age, Christopher Marlowe. What kind of guy was he? You just wrote a whole book about it. It would be impossible to summarize quickly, but just give us like a sense, like a thumbnail sketch of this man's character.
So this is a person who comes from a provincial background, not from London. He's born in Canterbury, which had been a very important city because of the premier cathedral, Catholic Cathedral of England, but it's now fallen on hard times. It's a city of refugees, lots of Protestant refugees from France and the Low Countries. It's a city that used to draw 100,000 people a year to come to the shrine of Thomas of Becket, but the shrine has been broken and destroyed. The whole pilgrimage world has come to an end. And Marlowe comes from a poor family. His father is a cobbler. The family is largely illiterate. His father might have had minimal capacity to read and write, but not anything beyond really probably signing his name. The father is in trouble with the law for beating up his apprentice and drawing blood. One of his sisters attacks someone in the street with a stick. I mean, this is this is not, how should we say, an elegant background. This is the world that Marlowe comes from, and that world would have been one where the overwhelming expectation would be that the son, Marlowe was the only surviving boy in the family, would take his place at the workbench along with his father and make shoes. Yeah. And that doesn't happen. So that point number one about Marlowe is that he doesn't follow in the pattern of his working class family that everyone would have expected for him to do.
Yeah.
And instead, point two, he gets an incredible education. And that almost never happened in this period, that someone from that social class gets a serious education. It was extremely rare and difficult. And we don't have a very firm account of how it could have happened. I have my speculations in the book as to how this could have happened. But what it meant was that Marlowe was very clever, was very quick and smart, and good at picking up things, and also probably making it clear to others that he was very smart. Because how did someone like this get discovered? My guess is that probably a priest in the town, an Anglican priest, saw that he was incredibly clever little boy. We know that it wasn't his local priest, his local Anglican priest, because that local priest in his parish was cited for being incapable of writing a sermon on his own. So this guy is not going to do it for Marlowe. But someone saw this incredible little boy is very, very quick. And if we can teach him enough Latin, he might be able to get into the fancy school called the King's School, which is connected to the great cathedral. And that's what happens. Marlowe, when he's 15, a month shy of the cutoff date for getting into that school, gets admitted to this extremely good school. It'd be like, I can't say what the equivalent would be, but to get into the fanciest school in your neighborhood, private school in your neighborhood.
Right. Right.
But from there, I mean, there's a lot to say. But
Yeah.
that's the first big move. And the first thing to say about Marlowe is he must have been a very quick study. And someone later in his life, and I talk about this in the book, said he was very sudden. And sudden seems right for Marlowe. There's something quick about him.
Yeah.
Dangerously quick.
Yeah, danger is a great word. And then he moves on to Cambridge.
Yeah, so he gets another.
Yeah.
He goes on from this school. He gets where he's just got a full scholarship. He gets a full scholarship to go to Cambridge University. There are two great universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge, and he gets a scholarship to go to Corpus Christi College, one of the colleges within Cambridge University. And there it becomes clear that he's been picked out to become an Anglican priest.
Yeah.
That's why these scholarships largely existed, to take poor kids who are very, very clever, very good, and train them to be priests, because the church needs personnel. It needs personnel because it's basically killed off its Catholic priests. A lot of them have gone, the ones who've survived have gone into exile. The young ones would have been Catholic priests, are no longer in England. They're studying abroad. The church needs people to be priests in the local parishes. And so it finds the cleverest little boys, trains them, and expects them to go out for the priesthood. Now, Christopher Marlowe happens to have the worst possible vocational abilities to be a priest. I mean, that's not where it's going to go. But that he must have signaled to people that that's what he was planning to do, because he wouldn't have got those scholarships without it.
Right. And, a major part of the story, and indeed a part of what happens to him and how he dies, is that you hypothesize that at some point during this time, probably at Cambridge, he is recruited to be a government spy.
Yeah, it's not even much of an hypothesis.
Yeah,
it's as close to a certainty as one can have in any of these very murky life records. What we know is that Marlowe spent first 3 years and got his BA degree, maybe 3.5 years, and then he went on to get an MA, again continuing what looked like on a path to the priesthood. And at the end of his 6th year, he did what students were expected to do, which was to submit papers to say, I've fulfilled the requirements, I'd like to have my MA degree. And the Cambridge University authorities said, no degree. You have not fulfilled the residence requirement. You were missing for long periods of time.
Yeah.
And you can prove that was the case even now. And it is suspected that you have gone abroad during these periods of absence, where the young dissident Catholics are being trained to be smuggled back into the country to topple a regime. So no degree. And then a month passes, nothing happens. And then a letter is sent from London, signed by the most important people in the regime. So it would be like as if everyone in the president's cabinet had signed a letter on behalf of this nobody, a cobbler's son from Canterbury.
Yeah.
And the letter says that Her Majesty would not be happy if someone who has done the state such important service as young Marlowe not be granted his degree. Give him his degree. And as you would expect, they gave him his degree.
Yeah.
But what does that mean? You can be sure that there aren't 10 dozen letters of this kind written on behalf of nobodies in Oxford and Cambridge. He had done something quite important for the regime. And we know from the subsequent pattern of his acquaintances and so-called friends that these are all people who are involved in this very dark, dangerous world of Elizabethan clandestine service spies.
So the young Chris Marlowe, he comes from a violent, poor family, and he is clever enough to go through to some of the remarkable schools of his time. And he's also secretly a spy and potentially informing on people who then get thrown in jail and put to death. And he's about 21 years old at this point, and he's also working on what will be one of the most groundbreaking plays of that age, which I think he puts on when he's about 23. Can you just talk about, we don't have too much time to go into every play, and you unpack these plays so wonderfully in the book, but just talk about how he burst onto the stage and how his work was so different than anything that had come before.
Well, first of all, just as a quick footnote, while he's at Cambridge doing his studies, he's also translating sexy poems by Ovid, poems that had not been translated before into English because they're about adultery, crazy afternoons of sex, abortion, you name it. But he starts playing, and he does the most remarkable translations of them, which are subsequently burned at a public burning by the state in the 1590s. Anyway, comes to London, and he must have already had the idea, and maybe more than just the idea, for this play. England. He comes to London in the 1583, 84, and he has, for reasons we don't understand completely, some way of breaking through to talk to someone, at least, who's a producer for one of the plays that are going on in London. London has a number of theaters. That the theater only began 1576. It's the first theater built in England since the ancient Romans had built a theater. So it's a totally new medium. It needs a lot of material. It's drawing, each of these theaters draws 2,000 or 3,000 people a day in the afternoon. And people go to take off from work and go to hear a play. They say not to see a play, but to hear a play, they say. And that's important for what I'm about to say. And Marlowe comes along and basically has a new way of writing plays. The plays up to that point Elizabethan plays are generally written in verse, and they're written in verse because there's no scenery, there's no lighting, there are no stage effects, so that what excited people was to hear very powerful language. And Elizabethans were very good at hearing poetry spoken. And the poetry, the verse that was written in those plays that existed up to that point, to our ears, and probably in retrospect to their ears now, sounds quite leaden. They're written actually, you can do reasonably good versions of what these are called 14ers. They have 14 syllables in them. Amazing grace, how sweet a sound that saved a wretch like me, that once was lost and now found, was blind and now can see. Okay, that's those are 14ers, but it sounds like a ballad. It doesn't sound like human speech. And Marlowe comes along and he invents this new writing called blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter. Nature that framed us of the four elements, doth warring within our breasts for regiment, doth teach us all to have aspiring minds. That's how this verse form sounds. It sounds like the way we're talking, but on steroids. It's turned up. It doesn't sound like a ballad. It sounds like speech, but it's powerful speech. And that, I think it's fair to say, blew people away. And began to change the way people are writing, including his contemporary William Shakespeare, who has a very good ear for what's going on here.
Can I just make one comment about that? I have always wondered about the language of Shakespeare and the language of this age. And it's probably not the most controversial thing to say that kind of the way Shakespeare used language is almost unsurpassed in sort of its complexity. And there's a kind of maximalist Baroque kind of extreme that he hits with his language. And there's an essay by Tolstoy, who hated Shakespeare, where he very much complains about Shakespeare's language. I mean, he hates Shakespeare for a lot of reasons, how immoral he is and everything. But like one of the things that he complains about most is this artifice in the language. And I just love your book answered a very interesting question that I've always had, which is like, why was the language so floored and so much toward this kind of Baroque extreme in that age. And the answer your book gives is it's sort of like car chases and CGI in Hollywood today. It's like, it's what the audience expects. It's what they feel like they're paying for. If you're not going to like turn it up to 11 on the language and the adjectives and the rhythm, then like, I'm just going to go find another play to go to. Right. So it's very much like what the market wanted. Right.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, what the market wanted and what they actually were trained. Look, this was a period in which you were forced to go to church every Sunday and listen to a 2-hour sermon, a very florid, as you say, Baroque sermon. So you had a lot of training, even if you were just an ordinary bloke who was precisely a shoemaker.
Yeah,
you went and you heard this remarkably beautiful, elaborate, fancy speech. You were required to do it. They fined you if you didn't go.
Yeah.
And so you have people who are trained in the way that our kids now are trained to hear all kinds of to hear and process all kinds of complicated signals that the older generation couldn't have processed so easily. Right. So there's that. But I just want to say one other thing about this, Mark, which is that, of course, you're absolutely right. Shakespeare never saw a big word he didn't love. I mean, he's crazy about it. But on the other hand, he's very clever because he tends to use those words, but then tell you what they mean. Mm-hmm. So when I think it's Lady Macbeth who says that the multitudinous seas incarnadine no less, then she says, making the green one red.
Right.
So she defines what incarnadine means, which is to make something red. And he's always like that. He's an incredible, irresistible, word whore. He just can't stop. But then he also defines them so that you can understand. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made it. Right. You can understand. You can get a thrill from the fanciness of the elaborate constructions, but you also can understand what's said.
Right. And so, I mean, I feel like we're just barely scratching the surface here, and I have so much I want to get to. So just to move it along a little bit, the other huge thing about Marlowe is not only is he inventing a new way to speak in blank verse, but it's the kinds of stories that he's telling and the kinds of characters that he's putting on the stage. And I think one thing that's just so striking about these characters that Marlowe puts up there, whether it's Dr. Faustus or Tamerlane, it's that there's a kind of world-conquering, smartest person in the room, almost criminal, amoral sensibility and character to kind of across these plays. And what's interesting, especially when you compare it to Shakespeare, is how Shakespeare is always doing what Faulkner said is the only art worth making, the human heart in conflict with itself. I mean, Shakespeare has a Macbeth who is, as ambitious as anybody, but his guilt just tears him apart. And that Macbeth's guilt is not something that you see in Marlowe's character. So tell us about like the Marlowe character, the Marlowe story.
Yeah, that's you set it up wonderfully and Macbeth is a great example. You have someone who betrays his allegiance, who kills the king, who becomes the ruler himself, and who's tormented by anxiety, guilt, fear, whose whole life is ruined by his act, and who finally ends in despair. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, that the tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's how that's what happens when you betray your allegiance, when you think you're going to win. Marlowe breaks through as a playwright with Tamerlane, which is a play about someone who breaks his oath of allegiance, who kills the king, who kills and conquers other kings, and who winds up incredibly happy. Oh, that's great. He's the king. He's the conqueror of the world. And he had grabbed this woman, the daughter of the king, and bring her along. I'm going to marry her. I'm in love with her. The whole play ends. You can't imagine how shocking this must have been in the 1590s.
It's shocking now. It's shocking now.
You have a play in which, the worst person in the world, imagine a play in which the worst person in the world becomes president, as it were. You just can't even.
Too on the nose. No.
You can't even pick such a thing.
It is remarkable. And there's a way that, I don't know. I think there's a story that I've heard you tell about how Hollywood came to you years ago when they were thinking of writing Shakespeare in Love, and they wanted to write a play about Shakespeare, and you told them, no, write about Marlowe. Marlowe's more interesting than Shakespeare, but there's a way that I feel like Marlowe as a person, just like his characters, there's something, dare I say, feel free to put me in my place, but like there's something inherently uninteresting about a completely unconflicted character. Like say someone like, I just watched Goodfellas recently, like the Joe Pesci character Tommy in Goodfellas. It's just that he's just completely violent, unstoppable, and the only thing that stops him is that he gets killed. Now, and they don't get killed in the Marlowe play, but I just think like with Shakespeare, you when you put him next to Marlowe, you just see how rich these characters are. They're so filled with so many different kinds of conflicting feelings. Whereas like Marlowe, it seems like not only his characters, but Marlowe the man was just sort of like, yeah, he may be exhausted or disgusted or what have you with life, but he's not like somebody who's like, oh, I wonder what I should do, really torn up inside. What do you think?
I mean, first of all, in the overarching account, that Shakespeare is the greater artist than Marlowe, I utterly agree with you. Yeah. I mean, of course, it's true. I mean, but that's only like saying that Albert Einstein was a better mathematician than me. I mean, right. That's of course. I mean, I think you would have to actually be, how should we say, quite eccentric to think that Shakespeare is not the greater of the artists. Right. But he's the greatest, arguably the greatest artist who ever lived. Right. And that's not only true, but there's also a kind of, I think, ethical core, a moral core in Shakespeare that is missing in Marlowe.
That's what I'm saying.
There was a loathing in Shakespeare, a loathing of gratuitous cruelty that is missing in Marlowe, who was probably gratuitously cruel himself. On the other hand, it's not, how should we say, it's not accidental that Marlowe wrote Tamburlaine and Shakespeare came back with Titus Andronicus, that Marlowe wrote The Jew of Malta and Shakespeare came back with Merchant of Venice, that Marlowe wrote Edward II and Shakespeare came back with Richard II, that Marlowe wrote Dr. Faustus and Shakespeare came back, let's say, with Hamlet or with The Tempest. That is to say, you can see in each case that Shakespeare is taking in what is astonishing about Marlowe, what he's breaking through and doing, and then figuring out what I can do with it. It's a little bit like the scene at the beginning of the movie Amadeus, if you saw it, when Salieri does his thing, and then Mozart comes along and does it actually much better.
Yeah.
Okay, so we start there. But then we'd have to add to that two things that a little bit conflict with what you said. That Marlowe writes, yes, the plays that you're describing, but he also writes Dr. Faustus, which is a play that isn't simply a kind of heady celebration of murderous violence and a kind of Nietzschean unleashing of the will. It's a play about someone who makes a deal with the devil and knows that it's going to come back and kill him in the end. He tries to get what he can out of it, but he also is haunted by the fact that he's going to face this terrifying ending. Yeah. And I think that corresponds to something that is almost certainly in Marlowe's own life. Yeah. So that it's not simply that in a kind of insouciant way, he thought he'd just do whatever he wanted. But I think he came to understand, and he, after all, is still a very young man in his late 20s. I think he came to understand that the noose was tightening around his neck and that he had tied the rope that was tightening around his neck.
And this is because he was a spy.
Well, for some of the reasons that you say, because he was a spy, because he was a provocateur, because he was going around saying things that you didn't say if you wanted to have a long, quiet life in Elizabethan England, that because he loved to walk on the wild side, and it was going to catch up with him.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just couldn't help as I was reading this to tie it into 1990s hip hop for some 400 years later when Tupac Shakur was on the scene. And I just thought the life of Tupac is very similar to Marlowe's in so many ways. I mean, he is precocious, he's brilliant. He is right at the moment when a kind of niche art form becomes commercial and global. He is the thing that I've never understood about Tupac, because it's so different than who I am as a person, and most people are, is just how much he provoked people and how much he loved danger. Even Mike Tyson, I saw an interview with Mike Tyson once, he said, I have hung out with Tupac and I'm afraid of him because he's afraid of nothing. And that's sort of how I imagine, not that Shakespeare is Tyson in this tortured analogy, but just like that Shakespeare must have looked at him, and many people must have looked at Marlowe and thought, like, what are you doing? Like, you're living like a crazy person.
Yes, I think you're right. I have, as you know, in my book, I have a kind of imaginary conversation between, we know that Shakespeare and Marlowe knew each other. It used to be thought maybe they didn't, but that would only be if one walked out the door and the other one walked in, just perfectly timed.
Right.
They were in a writing room, they wrote plays together. And you could easily imagine Marlowe provoking Shakespeare, Marlowe was good at this. That was his profession in some ways, at drawing Shakespeare's opinions out, and Shakespeare not going there. Shakespeare basically saying to himself, I have a wife and 3 kids back in Stratford. This is not me. I'm not going in the Marlowe direction.
Right. So I want to just do it. And I love the way you did that, by the way, the way you imagine this conversation between Marlowe and Shakespeare. It's just such great writing throughout the book. And I love that you take those little imaginative leaps. And on that note, I would just like to take a few imaginative leaps now with you. So we know that Marlowe, he was killed, and you go through all the evidence about kind of who murdered him, and was it really an argument over a dinner bill, or were the people he was hanging out with, who were part of, this kind of government apparatus of espionage, did they kill him on purpose for something that he did, and so on. But the reason why we know that, as you discuss in your book, is that there was a file or some kind of documentation that was relatively recently discovered that sort of said who was at that dinner and sort of who the culprits might be. But here's my actual question for you. Imagine that today there was a treasure trove of documents pulled up from under a floorboard in somewhere in London, right? And imagine that, your wildest dreams come true, and there is 3 or 4 documents in there that you would most like to obtain that, as far as we know, don't exist right now. Tell me, whether it's Shakespeare or Marlowe, what are the documents that you would just, in your wildest dreams, love to hold in your hands from that era?
From the whole era, from anyone in this.
Yeah.
Well, I would personally start with, there's a lost play by Shakespeare that I am haunted by. At the end of his career, we know that Shakespeare read Cervantes' Don Quixote. That's incredible. Yes. There was a renegade Irish Catholic named Shelton who found himself in Spain when Don Quixote came out. And lo and behold, he took the time, it must have worked very fast, to translate Don Quixote into English. And he gets it published eventually in London in time for Shakespeare to read it. So picture that. Picture the greatest playwright, arguably, who ever lived, reading the greatest or the first great novelist, and seeing that there's a whole new way of doing things. Yes. I sometimes think that now Shakespeare would love to do long form television, like Breaking Bad, or because he loved these stories that you could draw, but he could only basically be doing 2.5 hour stories. He could have had 12 hours, 24 hours, 5 seasons with 12 episodes. Right. But he couldn't in the form. So he sees this huge thing, this novel in which you could spread out a story. And then he writes a play based on that called Cardenio.
No kidding.
And the play is lost. So if I pull up the floorboards and find the lost play by Shakespeare, I would love to read it. I'd love to know what he did with Cervantes.
That's incredible.
Yeah. But there are many possibilities other than that. Of course, one can think of 1,000 things. Thinking about I would love to know. Let's say we could find let's say Marlowe visited the Elizabethan equivalent of a psychiatrist. He kept a good record of what the conversation was about. That'd be fun.
Yeah.
What the conversation was about.
On that note, I mean, you imagine this conversation in sort of a writer's room between Shakespeare and Marlowe. Imagine that you just get to go out to dinner with them yourself. What if you could just talk to them? You had an hour with them. What would you ask Marlowe about? What would you most want to ask Shakespeare about?
Well, can we speak extremely frankly? I mean, no, not you and I. And I speak extremely frankly to Marlowe.
Sure.
Shakespeare. I mean that is to say to Marlowe. I mean, it would be interesting. I don't know how one would draw it out. It would be interesting to know what it felt like to in a world of danger of the kind that he existed in, to draw out the secrets of people who trusted him, and then to pass them along, knowing what was going to happen to the people whom he betrayed.
Yeah,
I would love to know how he processed this. He's not a thug. He's a very complicated person with a very deep and complex mind. And I would love to know whether, if he could come clean, whether the dangerous things he's saying, Jesus and John were homosexual lovers, or anyone who doesn't like tobacco and boys is a fool, or I have as much a right to counterfeit as the Queen of England has to make coins. Did he mean any of these things? Did he actually, or these just provocations to try to draw other people out? What's going on here? I would love to have a frank answer to that. About Shakespeare, no, I would, Shakespeare, that isn't the kind of question one would like to ask about Shakespeare. I think in the case of Shakespeare, I would love to know in a, how should we say, nuanced way, what he actually believed, whether he actually credited. I think of Shakespeare as having the most complex and profound relation to the shibboleths of his time, to the belief in kingship or queenship, to the belief in religion. That where is he in relation to these things? He stages such complicated versions of human fate. I would love to actually plumb his deepest beliefs.
Yeah,
I don't think he would have told me anything truthfully.
Yeah,
very good at not doing that.
Yeah. He just sort of changes the subject.
I'd also like to know I would love to know whom he was sleeping with in 1600.
There was a few hilarious anecdotes in your book about like little tantalizing clues about Shakespeare. One was that when he first came to London, he like took care of people's horses by the door of the theater, and another was that when everybody wanted to go out and get drunk, he always said he was sick. Are these like real stories?
Well, they're not really, in the sense that they don't date from a contemporary who observed it. But in the 17th century, John Aubrey, who was a gossip collector, became interested in the 1640s and 50s in collecting information about famous people. And Shakespeare, by that time, in the middle of the 17th century, Shakespeare was famous, but had died in 1618. So he went around asking people, and he met someone who knew someone who performed with Shakespeare, but who was an old man at that point. All right, so we're going back 2 generations, and that's what he said. That what he told Aubrey was that Shakespeare was not a company keeper, whatever that means, and when invited out for a debauch, he would say that he was sick. That rings true to me. That partly because he gets a lot done, partly because he precisely doesn't get in that kind of trouble that Marlowe gets into. So I believe that that's the case. About the taking care of people's horses, that's an 18th century story. That's how he broke through by being a parking lot attendant.
I could get the coffee for the studio executive.
I don't believe it for a minute.
All right. Well, we got to wrap in a few minutes here. I wanted to turn just for my last couple questions to you yourself. The book is so wonderful. I loved the swerve. I mean, just your writing is just absolutely first rate. The book reads like a thriller. I don't want to puff you up too much here because we only have limited time. But
go ahead, puff me up.
But I truly love these books, and they're not a word too long. The pacing is just wonderful. So I guess just two questions about you as a writer and a scholar. The first is like, what writing advice do you have? I mean, here you've spent your whole life studying great writers, but here you are also a great writer, and especially to people who might be writing nonfiction. What do you have any like core principles about how you create this wonderful pace and interest in your works?
Well, a couple of things I can say. I think one is that I, at a certain point, found the academic writing, which I'm happy to do, slightly frustrating or perplexing, because if you're someone like I am, who spends his life thinking about, who loves novels, who loves stories, I began to think, if I love novels and stories so much, why can't I take advantage of some of the things that I know that good novelists do without faking it, without lying, making it up? But you should be able to use, if you care about these things, if you thrill to, I don't know, Dickens or Henry James, you should be able to see what they're doing to keep the reader actually, not because the reader is assigned to do it by some obnoxious teacher, but actually genuinely wants to turn the pages. How do you get people to turn the pages? Yeah. And so you begin to think about how to do that. And that actually was helpful for me. I literally began at a certain point to think, wait a minute, why am I suppressing the very thing that I love when I read it? I don't have to lie about the things that I'm writing. I can do nonfiction, but I can use some of those techniques. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that, it's, I shouldn't admit it, but it's great to have a good editor. You asked about the pace, but my editor, a wonderful person named Elaine Mason, my publisher, Norton, when I gave her the manuscript for Dark Renaissance, said, I think you should cut about 20% of it. I thought, what? I mean, I sweated blood over every one of those sentences. But I did, because I trust her and respect her. Yeah, I did actually cut quite a lot out. So when someone says the pace is great, I think, yeah, thanks, Elaine. Yeah. It's nice to have advice.
Well, you also have to be the kind of writer who listens to an editor. So you have that is a quality that you have. All right. So we've come to the end of the show here. I want to just ask you one last question. And folks, thanks to everybody who joined. Sorry we couldn't get to the questions. We just ran out of time here. But the book is called Dark Renaissance. It's about Christopher Marlowe. It is wonderful. Every bit as good as The Swerve. But Stephen, final question for you is, think about yourself for a moment, just as a critic. You've devoted your life, you've devoted decades and decades to studying Shakespeare and Elizabethan theater and, great writers of all time. What do you think it is about you that, to use a kind of contemporary term, what's your superpower? What do you think, what made you into a great reader of these works? What made you into a great scholar? What is that quality that you have that you think, I'm not asking you to kind of put down anybody else, but just look inside yourself and just say, like, what is the thing that made your career into the thing that it is?
Well, it's kind of you to ask in such flattering terms. And I without accepting the characterization, just too generous, I would say that two things. One is that I wrote some years ago in an academic book of mine that I began with the desire to speak with the dead. And I have, for all of my life, had some special feeling of wanting to feel that I'm in contact with the people whom I love, the writers I love, but who no longer live in the world. And not simply to be in contact with their texts as texts, their words, but to feel that I'm in contact with them as human beings. And in fact, I think that's the power of great literature, is to to get past, as it were, just the technical skills that are involved, but to feel you're in contact with a living human presence, somehow miraculously surviving death itself.
Mm.
And that has been, in a profound way, really, in a genuine way, my motive for my whole long life. And the only other thing I would say is that years ago, when I was writing my dissertation, I wrote my dissertation about Sir Walter Raleigh, Shakespeare's contemporary. And I remember writing my first sentence. Sir Henry Elverton, the King's Attorney General, was no friend to Sir Walter Raleigh. And I ran out of my room and I just buttonholed someone and said, I've written the first sentence of my dissertation. And I read it out. And he looked, what's so good about that? I said, don't you see, you can't tell whether this is a novel, historical novel, whether it's a work of history, whether it's a dissertation. You don't know for a moment. You just know it's a sentence. And that feeling, as I say, at the beginning, really already, that feeling that it's important to actually feel the pleasure of writing, the pleasure of catching a reader, and the reader doesn't know quite where he or she is, and you're going to take them there.
Yeah.
That has always appealed to me.
Mm. What a wonderful answer. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on to the show. And thank you. I heard through the grapevine that there's another William Shakespeare book maybe happening. Is this?
Yeah, too early. Yes, I hope so. Shakespeare is long, life is short. We'll see what happens.
Well, I feel like you're writing at the height of your powers here, so I can't wait for the next one.
You're very kind, Mark. Thank you.
All right, folks. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Stephen.
Bye, everyone.
And we'll see you next time on Thoughtful Bro.
Bye. Thank you.